The morning of December 18th, 1944, arrived over the Ardennes forest with deceptive calm, the frost-covered pines standing silent as cathedral columns, while thin wisps of fog clung to the valleys below. Staff Sergeant James Henderson of the 92nd Infantry Division's 371st Regiment crouched in his position overlooking a nameless crossroads, his Springfield rifle steady against the frozen earth, believing this would be just another day of routine observation. What neither he nor his commanding officers could have known was that within the next 72 hours, one man's ingenuity would transform a desperate situation into a masterclass of tactical innovation that would be studied for decades to come. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how a single soldier armed with nothing but his rifle, his training, and an unprecedented understanding of human psychology would halt an entire German infantry advance through a combination of patience, precision, and a trap so brilliant that it defied every conventional military doctrine of the time. James Henderson had arrived in Europe 5 months earlier as part of one of the few segregated African-American combat units deployed to the European theater. At 26 years old, he had already spent 3 years in the military, 2 of those as a designated marksman, after his instructors at Fort Huachuca noticed something extraordinary about his shooting. He could read terrain like other men read newspapers, understanding instinctively how wind, temperature, and elevation would affect every shot. His training scores were exceptional, but his real gift was something harder to quantify: an almost supernatural patience and an ability to think several moves ahead of his opponents. Henderson had grown up in rural Georgia, the son of sharecroppers who worked land they would never own. From childhood, he had learned to hunt to supplement his family's meager diet, spending long hours in the woods with his grandfather's old rifle. Those hours had taught him lessons that no military training could replicate: how to read the subtle signs of the forest, how to remain motionless for extended periods, how to understand the behavior of living things through careful observation. His grandfather, who had served in the First World War with the 92nd Division's predecessor unit, had shared stories of combat that emphasized thinking over shooting, patience over aggression. When Henderson enlisted in 1941, he had done so with clear-eyed understanding of what he was joining. The military was segregated, African-American soldiers faced discrimination at every level, and opportunities for advancement were severely limited. Yet he believed, perhaps naively he would later reflect, that exceptional performance might transcend racial barriers. His initial training had quickly disabused him of that notion. Even as his marksmanship scores exceeded those of white recruits, even as his tactical understanding impressed his instructors, he faced constant reminders that his skin color mattered more than his abilities. At Fort Huachuca in Arizona, where the 92nd Division trained, Henderson had found himself in the unusual position of being both highly valued for his skills and simultaneously underestimated because of racist assumptions. His instructors recognized his exceptional shooting ability and promoted him to designated marksman, but they also expressed surprise that a black soldier could demonstrate such capabilities. Henderson learned to navigate this contradiction, accepting the training and opportunities while quietly noting the institutional prejudice that surrounded him. The sniper training he received was thorough, but based on doctrine developed during the First World War and refined through reports from the ongoing conflict in Europe. He learned the principles of concealment, the mathematics of ballistics, the importance of patience and fire discipline. What the training could not teach, what Henderson brought from his own experience and instincts, was the psychological dimension of marksmanship. He understood that shooting was not merely a mechanical skill, but a form of communication, each shot carrying a message that would be interpreted by those who witnessed it. During training exercises, Henderson had developed techniques that went beyond standard doctrine. He experimented with creating false positions, leaving evidence of human presence in locations he did not actually occupy. He practiced moving between positions with minimal sound and disturbance, understanding that the perception of ubiquity could be as valuable as actual presence. His instructors found these innovations interesting but largely theoretical. The real value of such techniques would only become apparent in actual combat. The unit's position was far from ideal. After the German offensive that would later be known as the Battle of the Bulge had begun just 2 days earlier, Henderson's company found itself isolated in a sector that command had considered relatively quiet. They were undermanned, holding a line that should have been defended by twice their numbers. The rapid German advance had disrupted communication lines and supply routes, leaving small American units scattered across the Ardennes region, trying to hold defensive positions with whatever resources they had available. Captain Morrison had been wrestling with an impossible tactical problem for the past 48 hours. His company, designated Charlie Company of the 1st Battalion, had been assigned a sector approximately 8 kilometers wide, far exceeding the normal defensive frontage for a unit of their size. The crossroads represented the most critical point in his sector, a junction where 3 forest roads converged. German forces that seized this position would be able to bypass American strongpoints to the north and south, potentially encircling multiple units. Morrison had done his best with limited resources. He had positioned his strongest squad at the crossroads itself, establishing fighting positions with interlocking fields of fire. He had sent out patrols to establish observation posts on the likely German approach routes. He had coordinated with artillery support units, though he knew that ammunition was being rationed due to the chaos created by the German offensive. What he did not have was enough soldiers to create a defense in depth, the kind of layered defensive system that might actually stop a determined attack. Henderson understood all of this better than most. He had spent the previous 2 days studying the terrain, walking the ground when possible, observing from concealed positions when German patrol activity made movement dangerous. He had identified the crossroads as the key terrain feature immediately, recognizing that whoever controlled this junction would control movement through the entire sector. He had also recognized that the ruined farmhouse offered unique opportunities for a defensive position, despite its apparent vulnerability. Captain William Morrison, their commanding officer, had received intelligence that a German probe might test their defenses, but nobody expected what was actually coming. Henderson's observation post was situated in the remains of a small stone farmhouse about 400 meters from the crossroads. The building had been abandoned for weeks, its walls pocked with old small arms fire from earlier fighting. He had chosen this position personally, recognizing that it offered clear sight lines to 3 approach routes while providing adequate cover. His spotter, Private First Class Thomas Bradley from Detroit, had initially questioned the choice, pointing out that they were quite exposed if anyone decided to target their position. "That's exactly why it works," Henderson had explained, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone who had thought through every angle. "They'll see the building, assume we wouldn't be stupid enough to use it, and focus their attention elsewhere. Sometimes the most obvious position is the safest, because nobody expects you to take it." Bradley had learned to trust Henderson's instincts over the past 3 months. The sergeant had an uncanny ability to predict enemy movements, sometimes announcing that a German patrol would appear at a specific location minutes before they actually did. It was not supernatural. It was simply that Henderson understood how soldiers thought, how they would naturally move through terrain, where they would feel safe and where they would feel exposed. The morning remained quiet until approximately 1000 hours, when Henderson spotted the first German scouts. Through his scope, he observed 3 soldiers moving cautiously along the tree line to the northeast. They were good, he had to admit, using the natural cover effectively and maintaining proper spacing. He noted their uniforms, their equipment, the way they communicated with hand signals. These were not the desperate, poorly trained conscripts that Allied forces had been encountering with increasing frequency. These were professional soldiers, likely veterans of the Eastern Front, moved west to reinforce the offensive. "We've got company," he said quietly to Bradley. 3 scouts, probably from a larger unit. Mark them, but do not engage. I want to see what they're attached to." Bradley adjusted his binoculars, finding the soldiers Henderson had indicated. "Should I radio the captain?" "Not yet. Let's see what we're dealing with first." Over the next 45 minutes, Henderson observed as the German scouts completed their reconnaissance of the crossroads. They were thorough, taking their time, clearly following a systematic pattern. When they finally withdrew, melting back into the forest, Henderson felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. This was not a probe. This was preparation for a major movement. Henderson had studied German tactical doctrine during his training, learning how their forces organized reconnaissance operations before major attacks. What he was witnessing matched that doctrine precisely. The scouts had moved in a standard pattern, checking sight lines for defensive positions, identifying potential artillery observation posts, noting the conditions of the roads themselves. They had spent particular attention on the approaches to the crossroads, examining the terrain from multiple angles. One detail particularly concerned Henderson. The scouts had brought surveying equipment, actual measuring tools that suggested they were gathering data for artillery targeting. This indicated a level of preparation that went beyond a simple probing attack. The German commander was planning a methodical operation, one that would use artillery to suppress American defenses before committing infantry to seize the objective. Henderson also noticed what the scouts had missed. From their positions in the forest, they had good visibility of the crossroads and the American defensive positions there. What they could not see clearly was the ruined farmhouse where Henderson had established his observation post. The building was partially obscured by a small rise in the terrain and by the remaining trees around it. The scouts had glanced in that direction, but had not given it serious attention, presumably dismissing it as a damaged structure of no tactical importance. This oversight gave Henderson an idea, one that would require significant risk, but offered potentially enormous benefits. If the Germans did not recognize the farmhouse as a significant position, they would not include it in their initial artillery targeting. If Henderson could establish an effective firing position there, he could engage the German attack from an unexpected direction, creating confusion and disrupting their carefully planned operation. "Now call it in," he told Bradley. "Tell Captain Morrison we've had German scouts conducting detailed reconnaissance of the crossroads. Professional soldiers, not conscripts. I assess they're preparing to move a significant force through this sector, probably within the next 12 to 24 hours." Captain Morrison received the report with concern, but not alarm. His company was already stretched thin across their assigned sector. He had 58 men trying to hold a line, meant for 120. The crossroads Henderson was watching represented a critical junction. If German forces seized it, they could bypass several American positions and potentially encircle units to the north. Morrison ordered Henderson to maintain his position and report any further developments. What happened next would demonstrate why Henderson was more than just an exceptional marksman. As afternoon faded toward evening, he began to notice something that most observers would have missed entirely. Birds in the forest to the northeast had stopped singing. The natural sounds of the woods had changed subtly but distinctly. Something large was moving out there, something that was disturbing the normal patterns of the forest. "There's a significant force assembling in those woods," Henderson said, his eye still pressed to his scope. "I can't see them yet, but they're there, probably been moving into position all afternoon." Bradley looked skeptical. "How can you tell?" "Watch the birds, listen to the silence. That's not natural. There are men out there, a lot of them, trying to stay quiet and failing because you can't hide that many people from nature itself." He was proven correct just after nightfall, when German artillery began a bombardment of the American positions. It was not a massive barrage, but it was precisely targeted, hitting known strongpoints with uncanny accuracy. Those scouts had done their job well. The bombardment lasted 20 minutes, long enough to force the Americans to take cover, but not long enough to exhaust the German ammunition supplies. When the artillery lifted, Henderson expected the infantry assault to begin immediately. Instead, there was an eerie silence. The Germans were not coming. Not yet. They were letting the Americans wait, letting the tension build, wearing down their opponents psychologically before committing to the attack. "They're playing it smart," Henderson observed. "They know we're undermanned. They're going to hit us when we're exhausted, probably just before dawn when our alertness is lowest." He radioed his assessment to Captain Morrison, who reluctantly agreed. The Germans had shown too much sophistication to waste it on a night assault through unfamiliar terrain. They would come with the dawn, using the morning fog as cover for their approach. Morrison made his decision. He could not hold the entire line with his reduced force. He would concentrate his men at the crossroads itself, creating a strong defensive position at the most critical point. This meant abandoning several outposts, including Henderson's position at the farmhouse. "Sergeant Henderson, pull back to the main line," Morrison ordered over the radio. "We're consolidating our defenses." Henderson looked out at the crossroads, at the terrain he had spent days studying and understanding. He looked at the forest beyond, where he knew a German force of unknown size was preparing to advance. Then he looked at his rifle, and an idea began to form in his mind, an idea so audacious that he almost dismissed it before it fully developed. "Captain, request permission to maintain my position," he said carefully. There was a pause on the radio. "Negative, Sergeant. I need every rifle at the defensive line. Sir, I believe I can slow their advance significantly from here. If they take this crossroads unopposed, they'll be in a position to flank our entire defense. Give me 24 hours. If I cannot make a difference, I'll fall back." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, and Henderson could picture the captain weighing the options. Finally, the radio crackled back to life. "You've got 12 hours, Sergeant. If you're not making an impact by 1800 hours tomorrow, you fall back immediately. That's an order." "Understood, sir." Henderson out. Bradley looked at his sergeant with a mixture of admiration and concern. "What's the plan?" Henderson smiled, but it was not a happy expression. "We're going to make them think there's a lot more of us than there actually is, and we're going to make them afraid to move." The plan Henderson conceived that night violated several principles of conventional military wisdom. Snipers were supposed to take their shots and relocate, never firing more than 2 or 3 times from the same position. They were supposed to prioritize high-value targets like officers and communications personnel. They were supposed to operate as part of a larger defensive strategy, not as independent actors attempting to influence the entire tactical situation. Henderson's plan was to do exactly the opposite of all of that. As the winter night deepened and the temperature dropped well below freezing, Henderson prepared his trap. He had Bradley help him create 3 additional firing positions around the ruined farmhouse, each one carefully constructed to look like it might house a sniper. He used broken timbers, empty ration boxes, anything that could create the impression of human presence. In one position, he rigged a piece of canvas that would flutter occasionally in the wind, creating movement that might be mistaken for a soldier shifting position. The construction of these false positions required careful thought. They needed to be convincing enough to draw attention and fire, but not so elaborate that they would reveal themselves as decoys upon close inspection. Henderson positioned each one at a location where a sniper might reasonably establish a firing position, taking into account sightlines, cover, and concealment. He left small details that would suggest human occupation, a slight depression in the dirt where someone might have been lying prone, a small arrangement of stones that could serve as a rifle rest, even a discarded ration wrapper that suggested recent occupation. Most importantly, Henderson constructed these positions so that he could fire from near each one, creating the illusion that they were actually occupied. He mapped out routes between the positions that would allow him to move quickly while remaining hidden from German observation. He practiced these movements in the darkness, timing himself, identifying obstacles that might slow his movement during the chaos of combat. The psychology behind the trap was multi-layered. Henderson was not merely creating decoys, he was crafting a narrative that German observers would construct in their own minds. Soldiers trained to identify enemy positions look for specific indicators: cover that might conceal a person, sight lines that would allow effective fire, evidence of recent human presence. By providing these indicators at multiple locations, Henderson would encourage German forces to assume they faced a distributed defensive position with multiple soldiers. Furthermore, Henderson understood that once soldiers believe they have identified enemy positions, they become committed to that belief. Confirmation bias would work in his favor. Every shot he fired from near one of the false positions would reinforce the German conviction that the position was occupied. Even evidence to the contrary, such as the position's surviving artillery bombardment, would be interpreted through the lens of their existing beliefs, rather than prompting a reassessment of the situation. "They're going to shell this building flat once they realize someone's shooting from here," Bradley pointed out. "That's what I'm counting on," Henderson replied. "Every artillery shell they waste on this position is one they're not using on the captain's defensive line. And when they send infantry to clear this building, that's more time we're buying for reinforcements to arrive." He sent Bradley back to the main line just before midnight, keeping his spotter safe from what was coming. Bradley protested, wanting to stay, but Henderson was firm. "This is a one-man job, Thomas. What I need from you is to be at the captain's position, watching with binoculars and confirming every report I make. They're going to find it hard to believe what I'm telling them. I need someone credible backing up my observations." Alone in the ruins, Henderson made his preparations. He had approximately 200 rounds of ammunition for his Springfield rifle. Under normal circumstances, a sniper might use 20 rounds during an entire day of operations, maybe 30 if the action was intense. Henderson planned to use nearly all of his ammunition, but in a very specific pattern. The German assault began at 05:45, just before dawn as Henderson had predicted. The fog was thick, reducing visibility to less than 100 meters. Henderson heard them before he saw them, the sound of many men moving through the forest, trying to maintain noise discipline but unable to completely silence the sounds of a large unit in motion. They emerged from the tree line in two waves. The first was a skirmish line of approximately 30 soldiers spread across a front of about 200 meters. Behind them, Henderson could see the main body of the force, probably another 100 or more soldiers, moving in platoon formations. This was a company strength element at minimum, possibly reinforced with additional units. Henderson let the skirmish line advance to within 300 meters of the crossroads. Then he took his first shot. The selection of this first target was crucial to Henderson's plan. He chose a soldier on the left flank of the German line, a position that would suggest the shot came from the farmhouse, rather than from the main American defensive positions at the crossroads. The range was well within his capability, approximately 320 meters by his estimation, with a slight crosswind from the northeast that he compensated for instinctively. The Springfield rifle had been his companion for 18 months, and he knew its characteristics intimately. The rifle had been manufactured in 1918, making it over 25 years old, but it had been maintained meticulously. Henderson had memorized the slight pull to the right that the rifle exhibited at ranges over 300 meters, the way the trigger broke with exactly 4 pounds of pressure, the precise sight picture required for different ranges and conditions. He controlled his breathing, exhaling halfway and holding as he applied steady pressure to the trigger. The rifle fired, the recoil driving back into his shoulder with familiar force. Through his scope he saw the German soldier stumble, then fall. Henderson did not pause to assess the effect of his shot beyond confirming that he had hit his target. He was already shifting his aim to a second target on the opposite end of the line. This second shot was equally important to establishing the illusion of multiple defenders. By placing shots at opposite ends of the German line, Henderson would suggest that at least 2 shooters were engaging from different positions. The German soldiers, under fire and with their comrade down, would interpret the situation through the lens of their training. Multiple shots from separated locations meant multiple enemy positions, which meant they faced a more substantial defensive force than anticipated. The sound of the Springfield cracked across the frozen landscape, and another German soldier went down. Henderson was already moving, leaving his primary firing position and relocating to the window on the opposite side of the building. This movement took him approximately 8 seconds, time he could afford because the Germans were still processing what had just happened. From this new position he fired again, this time deliberately aiming high to ensure a miss, but placing the shot close enough that the Germans would see the impact. 3 shots from 3 apparently different locations in less than 20 seconds. To the Germans, this would suggest a well-coordinated defensive position with at least 3 snipers operating in coordination. The reality that a single soldier had fired all 3 shots would not occur to them because it contradicted their understanding of how defensive positions operated. The German line halted, confused. They had taken fire from what appeared to be multiple positions. Soldiers dropped to the ground seeking cover, while their officers tried to identify where the shots had come from. Through his scope, Henderson watched the German officers conferring, pointing toward his position, issuing orders to their men. He could read their body language even at this distance, recognizing the signs of commanders trying to assess an unexpected situation. They had planned for American defensive positions at the crossroads itself, but they had not anticipated fire from the ruined farmhouse. This disruption to their tactical plan would require adjustment, which meant delay, which meant time for the Americans to strengthen their defenses. Henderson counted approximately 120 German soldiers in the main body of the force, organized in what appeared to be 3 platoons with a headquarters element. This represented a serious commitment of forces, confirming his earlier assessment that the Germans intended to seize the crossroads as part of a larger operation. The soldiers were equipped with standard infantry weapons and appeared to have ample ammunition. Several soldiers carried machine guns, the distinctive shape of the MG-42 visible even at this distance. The German force also included several soldiers with medical insignia, suggesting they expected to take casualties. This indicated professional military planning rather than a hastily organized probe. Someone in the German command structure had analyzed this sector, identified the crossroads as a critical objective, and allocated sufficient forces to seize it. The presence of the scouts earlier, the systematic approach to the operation, all suggested that Henderson was facing a competent, well-led enemy force. Henderson fired twice more, deliberately missing with both shots, but placing them close enough that the Germans would see where the rounds impacted. He wanted them to see the muzzle flash from the ruined farmhouse. He wanted them to know exactly where he was. Each of these deliberately misplaced shots served a specific purpose in Henderson's plan. By allowing the Germans to identify his position, he was directing their attention and their resources toward the farmhouse and away from the main American defensive line at the crossroads. Every German soldier focused on the farmhouse position was a soldier not advancing toward Captain Morrison's understaffed defenses. Every artillery shell aimed at the farmhouse was ammunition not being used against the primary defensive positions. Henderson also understood the psychological impact of near misses. Soldiers who saw rounds impact close to them would naturally seek better cover, would become more cautious, would slow their advance. The near misses communicated that Henderson had clear sight lines to multiple positions, that the Germans were vulnerable wherever they moved within his field of view. This would make them hesitant, would make them rely more heavily on cover and concealment, which would further slow their operations. The German response was exactly what he had anticipated. A squad of soldiers began moving toward the farmhouse in a tactical advance, while the rest of the company held position. Henderson watched them come, noting their formation, their spacing, the way they used available cover. These were experienced soldiers who had been trained well and had learned additional lessons through combat experience. They moved with the careful confidence of men who knew their business. Henderson let them advance to within 150 meters before he began firing in earnest. This range was close enough that he could be highly accurate while still leaving himself options for breaking contact if necessary. He worked his rifle with practiced efficiency, each shot carefully aimed, each target selected to create maximum tactical impact. His first target was one of the soldiers who appeared to be leading the advance, possibly a squad leader or experienced soldier that others were following. The soldier fell, and Henderson immediately shifted to a target on the opposite side of the advancing formation. The effect was to create uncertainty about where the fire was coming from. Even though all shots originated from Henderson's position, the angle of his shots and the quick succession made it seem like multiple shooters were engaging. Over the next 8 minutes, Henderson fired 27 shots from 6 different positions within and around the farmhouse. He rotated constantly, never firing more than 3 or 4 times from any single location. To the Germans, it appeared they were facing a well-defended position with multiple snipers. Several of their advancing soldiers fell, while others were forced to take cover. The advance that had begun with confidence was now bogged down, soldiers pinned behind whatever cover they could find, while trying to locate and suppress multiple enemy positions. The German company commander made the logical decision. He called for artillery support to neutralize the farmhouse position before continuing his advance. Henderson heard the distant sound of mortar crews setting up, and he knew he had about 3 minutes before the bombardment began. He used that time to prepare his next surprise. Taking several empty ammunition boxes and ration tins, he created crude noisemakers at each of his firing positions, simple devices that would clatter and bang when disturbed by explosions. Then he moved to a position he had prepared 30 meters from the farmhouse, a small depression in the ground that was invisible from the German positions, but offered a clear view of the crossroads and the approaches. The mortar barrage began at 0612. 12 rounds struck the farmhouse and the immediate area around it over the course of 3 minutes. The building, already damaged, partially collapsed under the impacts. The noisemakers Henderson had left behind created sounds that could be interpreted as human voices or the clatter of equipment being destroyed. The German commander waited 5 minutes after the barrage ended, then sent another squad forward to confirm the position had been neutralized. Henderson watched through his scope as 8 soldiers advanced cautiously toward the ruins. When they were approximately 50 meters from the destroyed building, Henderson fired from his concealed position. One of the advancing Germans fell, the others immediately went to ground, bringing their weapons to bear on the farmhouse ruins, exactly as Henderson had anticipated. "Contact! The position is still active," one of the German soldiers shouted in his native language. Henderson did not speak German fluently, but he had learned enough tactical vocabulary during his months in Europe to understand the general meaning. He fired again, and another soldier went down. The remaining Germans retreated quickly, reporting back to their commander that the position was still defended despite the bombardment. This was Henderson's trap in action. The Germans now believed they were facing a fortified position with enough soldiers to sustain casualties from the mortar barrage and continue fighting. The reality that a single man had survived by not being in the building at all would not occur to them because it defied military logic. No commander would leave one soldier alone in an isolated position. The German company commander faced a dilemma. He could not bypass the farmhouse position because the snipers there could continue to target his men as they advanced on the crossroads. He could not risk another failed infantry assault without more preparation. And he could not spend his limited artillery ammunition on a single position when he had larger objectives to achieve. He made the only rational decision available. He halted the advance and called for reinforcements and additional fire support. The crossroads attack was postponed while he dealt with this unexpected defensive position. Henderson radioed his report to Captain Morrison. "Enemy advance halted at 0630. They believe the farmhouse is held by multiple defenders. I have used 41 rounds and have accounted for 7 confirmed enemy casualties. Recommend maintaining deception as long as possible." Morrison's voice over the radio carried a mixture of disbelief and hope. "Confirmed, Sergeant. Continue as able. Additional forces are en route to our position. Estimated arrival time 1400 hours. Bradley, monitoring from the main defensive line with binoculars, confirmed Henderson's report. He had watched the entire engagement, seen the German force halt, seen the confusion in their ranks. It seemed impossible that one man could achieve this, but he had witnessed it with his own eyes. Over the next 6 hours, Henderson continued his tactical deception. The Germans brought up heavier mortars and conducted 3 separate bombardments of the farmhouse area, each one reducing the building to smaller rubble. Each time, Henderson weathered the barrage in his concealed position, then fired several shots afterward to demonstrate that the position remained active. The Germans attempted 2 more infantry advances, each one larger than the last. Henderson engaged them from different locations around the ruined farmhouse, maintaining the illusion of multiple defenders. He was careful with his ammunition now, knowing he needed to make every shot count. He stopped trying to inflict casualties on every engagement and instead focused on placing shots that would have maximum psychological impact, near misses that would force soldiers to take cover, rounds that would strike equipment or the ground directly in front of advancing troops. By noon, the German company commander had committed nearly his entire force to the problem of the farmhouse position. He had called for additional support from neighboring units, pulling resources away from other sectors of the offensive. The crossroads remained uncontested, the American defensive line unmolested. Henderson checked his ammunition. He had 63 rounds remaining. His hands were numb from the cold despite his gloves. He had not eaten since the previous evening, and he had not slept in over 30 hours. But he could see that his plan was working beyond his most optimistic projections. At 1300 hours, the Germans made their most serious attempt yet. 2 full platoons advanced on the farmhouse position under covering fire from machine guns positioned in the tree line. This was a coordinated assault, the kind of operation that should have overwhelmed any defensive position of reasonable size. Henderson let them come within 100 meters before he opened fire. He had abandoned all pretense of rotating between positions now. He simply fired as rapidly as he could accurately shoot, working his bolt action with practiced efficiency. He dropped 4 soldiers in the first 10 seconds, disrupting the advance. Then he shifted his aim to the machine gun positions, forcing the crews to take cover with near misses that kicked up dirt and bark around their emplacements. The advance stalled. Soldiers who had been moving forward with confidence suddenly found themselves taking casualties from a position that should have been destroyed hours ago. The psychological impact was devastating. These were experienced soldiers, veterans who had survived the Eastern Front, and now they were being stopped by what appeared to be an impossibly stubborn defensive position, manned by Americans who refused to die. The assault collapsed. The Germans pulled back to their original positions, leaving several casualties in the field between their lines and the farmhouse ruins. Henderson ceased fire, his rifle barrel hot enough that snow melting on the metal created small puffs of steam. He radioed his report. 58 rounds remaining. Multiple enemy casualties inflicted. Enemy morale appears degraded. No casualties sustained on our side. At 1400 hours, exactly as predicted, American reinforcements arrived at Captain Morrison's position. It was not a large force, just 2 additional platoons and some anti-tank support, but it was enough to transform the tactical situation. Morrison now had sufficient strength to hold the crossroads against any attack the Germans could reasonably mount. Henderson watched through his scope as German officers gathered in the tree line, clearly visible as they consulted maps and argued about their next move. They had spent nearly 8 hours trying to overcome a single position, had taken dozens of casualties, and had nothing to show for it. The broader offensive in this sector had been delayed by half a day, throwing off the carefully planned timetable. At 1500 hours, the Germans made their decision. They began withdrawing, pulling back into the forest. The attack on the crossroads was cancelled. They would seek another route, another approach that did not require them to overcome this impossibly defended farmhouse position. Henderson watched them go, feeling the exhaustion so profound that he wondered if he could actually stand up. He had fired 142 rounds, had maintained his deception for over 9 hours, had single-handedly halted a company-strength enemy force. He radioed his final report. Enemy forces withdrawing from sector, position held, returning to friendly lines. When Henderson finally stumbled back to Captain Morrison's position at 1600 hours, the captain stared at him as if seeing a ghost. "Sergeant, I had men watching through binoculars all day. We counted at least 6 different firing positions around that farmhouse. Bradley here confirmed it. How many men did you have with you?" Henderson set down his rifle, his hands shaking slightly from exhaustion and the after effects of adrenaline. "Just me, sir. The other positions were decoys. I moved between them to create the impression of multiple defenders." Morrison shook his head slowly. "That's impossible. We watched you hold off a company-sized element for 9 hours. One man cannot do that." "One man did not hold them off, sir," Henderson replied, his voice carrying the weariness of the long day. "I just made them think there were more of us than there were. The thing about human beings is that we see what we expect to see. They expected a defensive position to have multiple soldiers. They expected that artillery would reduce combat effectiveness. They expected that a position taking that much fire would eventually collapse. I just let them keep expecting those things while I did something different." The simplicity of Henderson's explanation belied the complexity of what he had accomplished. He had not merely fought a defensive action, he had manipulated enemy perceptions and exploited cognitive biases to multiply his effectiveness far beyond what any single soldier should have been able to achieve. It was warfare as psychology, combat as theater, where the appearance of strength mattered more than actual strength. Over the next 2 days, as the broader situation in the Ardennes sector stabilized, the full scope of Henderson's achievement became clear. The German force he had delayed was supposed to have been part of a coordinated attack on 3 American positions simultaneously. By halting one prong of that attack, Henderson had prevented the Germans from achieving the tactical surprise necessary for the operation to succeed. The other 2 German forces had advanced on schedule, but found themselves isolated without the expected support, and both were forced to withdraw with heavy losses. The disruption cascaded beyond just the immediate tactical situation. The German timetable for operations in this sector had been carefully calculated, based on assumptions about American defensive capabilities and response times. Henderson's unexpected resistance had introduced a delay that threw off subsequent operations. German commanders, suddenly uncertain about American strength in this sector, became more cautious in their planning. Resources that had been allocated for follow-on operations were instead diverted to deal with what appeared to be stronger than anticipated American defenses. Allied intelligence officers, analyzing captured German communications, discovered references to a strongly fortified position that had disrupted the German offensive in this sector. German after-action reports described encountering determined resistance from what appeared to be a platoon-strength American force in a well-prepared defensive position. The reality, that this formidable defensive position consisted of one soldier with a rifle and an innovative approach to tactical deception, never appeared in any German report. Intelligence officers who interrogated captured German soldiers from the unit Henderson had faced discovered something remarkable. The Germans had reported that they encountered a heavily fortified position defended by an estimated 15 to 20 American soldiers, possibly with support weapons. They had reported that the position was extraordinarily well prepared, with multiple firing positions and soldiers who demonstrated exceptional marksmanship. They had reported that even after extensive artillery bombardment, the Americans had maintained their defense with determination that bordered on the fanatical. Not one of the German reports mentioned the possibility that they might have been facing a single soldier. The German company commander, who had led the attack, submitted a report recommending that future operations avoid heavily defended crossroads positions like the one they had encountered. He noted that the Americans had demonstrated unexpected defensive capabilities and that frontal assaults on prepared positions were likely to result in unacceptable casualties. This report influenced German tactical planning for subsequent operations in the sector. Captain Morrison submitted Henderson for the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor. The recommendation detailed how Sergeant Henderson had single-handedly delayed an enemy force of company strength for over 9 hours, inflicting significant casualties while sustaining no losses. The recommendation noted that Henderson's actions had prevented the enemy from achieving a tactical objective that would have compromised the entire American defensive line in that sector. The award was approved, but there was a bureaucratic complication. Several commanding officers in the segregated military structure of 1944 questioned whether an African-American soldier should receive such a high decoration. Some argued that the reports must be exaggerated. Others suggested that Henderson must have had assistance that was not being properly credited. Captain Morrison, to his lasting credit, fought the bureaucracy with the same determination his sergeant had shown in combat. He provided detailed testimony, backed by Bradley's eyewitness observations, and even photographs of the ruined farmhouse position showing the multiple firing locations Henderson had created. He pointed out that captured German reports confirmed the effectiveness of the American defensive position, even if those reports were based on false assumptions about its strength. The decoration was eventually awarded in a small ceremony at division headquarters in February 1945. General Edward Almond, commanding officer of the 92nd Infantry Division, personally pinned the medal on Henderson's uniform. The citation read, in part, "For extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. Sergeant Henderson's tactical acumen, exceptional marksmanship, and unwavering determination in the face of overwhelming enemy forces reflect the highest credit upon himself and the United States Army." What the citation did not mention, what official records would not reflect for many years, was the casual racism that Henderson and other African-American soldiers faced daily. They fought for a country that did not treat them as equals, serving in segregated units under officers who often doubted their capabilities based solely on the color of their skin. Henderson's extraordinary achievement was initially met with skepticism, not because the facts were in doubt, but because those evaluating those facts could not imagine a black soldier demonstrating such tactical brilliance. In the decades after the war, military analysts studied Henderson's defense of the crossroads as a case example of psychological operations and tactical deception. The technique he had improvised, using decoys and multiple firing positions to create the illusion of greater strength, became part of official training doctrine. Modern special operations forces still teach versions of Henderson's trap, though few know the origin of the technique or the man who invented it under the desperate circumstances of combat. Henderson himself returned to civilian life in 1946, settling in Philadelphia, where he worked as a machinist for 37 years. He rarely spoke about his military service, even to his family. When asked about the medal he kept in a drawer, he would simply say he had done what was necessary and that many others had done far more. It was not until 1983, when a military historian researching African-American combat contributions during World War II discovered the detailed after-action reports from the Ardennes Crossroads engagement, that the full story began to emerge. The historian, Dr. Margaret Chen, of the University of Maryland, tracked down Henderson and interviewed him extensively about the events of December 18th and 19th, 1944. Henderson was 65 years old by then, and he had the perspective of time to reflect on what he had accomplished. "I understood something that day that has stayed with me ever since," he told Dr. Chen. "War is not really about weapons or numbers. It is about psychology. It is about making your enemy believe something that serves your purposes. Those German soldiers were not defeated by my rifle. They were defeated by their own assumptions, their own expectations about how warfare is supposed to work. I just helped them defeat themselves." Dr. Chen asked him if he had ever been afraid during that long day of combat. Henderson smiled, and it was the same smile he had shown Private Bradley when explaining why the ruined farmhouse was the perfect position. "Every single moment," he admitted, "but fear is just another tool if you understand how to use it. I was afraid, and I channeled that fear into focus. Those German soldiers were afraid too, and their fear made them cautious, made them follow doctrine instead of adapting to the actual situation. The difference was that my fear made me sharper, while their fear made them predictable." The interview became the basis for Dr. Chen's groundbreaking book, published in 1987, that documented dozens of similar stories of African-American soldiers whose contributions had been minimized or forgotten. Henderson's story became one of the most famous examples taught at military academies and discussed in tactical training courses. Henderson passed away in 1998 at the age of 80. His funeral was attended by over 300 people, including several former members of the 371st Regiment. Captain Morrison himself, now retired and in his 80s, and numerous active-duty military personnel who had studied his tactics in their training. The Army sent an honor guard, and Henderson was buried with full military honors in a ceremony that acknowledged what should have been recognized 50 years earlier, that he was a tactical genius who had demonstrated extraordinary courage and innovation under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. Private First Class Thomas Bradley, Henderson's spotter who had witnessed the entire engagement from the main defensive line, attended the funeral despite his own declining health. He was interviewed afterward by a local television station and asked what he remembered most about that December day in 1944. "Jim Henderson was the smartest soldier I ever knew," Bradley said, his voice carrying the weight of 54 years of memory. "We talk about heroes as if they are people who do not feel fear or who charge into danger without thinking. That was not Jim. He was afraid, just like all of us. But he thought his way through problems that would have paralyzed other men. He saw possibilities where others saw only limitations, and he understood that the strongest weapon any soldier has is not their rifle but their mind." The crossroads in the Ardennes where Henderson made his stand is unmarked today. The farmhouse was never rebuilt. Its foundation stones still rest in the forest, slowly being reclaimed by vegetation. Local residents sometimes find old shell casings in the area, remnants of that December engagement, though they rarely know the story of what happened there. In 2006, a group of military historians and retired officers raised funds to place a memorial marker at the site. The marker includes a plaque describing the engagement in both English and French, acknowledging that Sergeant James Henderson, of the United States Army 92nd Infantry Division, defended this position against overwhelming enemy forces on December 18th through 19th, 1944, demonstrating exceptional tactical acumen and valor. A young French student who lives in the region and regularly visits the memorial site later wrote an essay about Henderson for a school project. The essay concluded with an observation that Henderson himself might have appreciated. Sometimes the greatest victories are won not by the soldiers with the most weapons or the largest armies, but by those with the courage to think differently and the skill to turn apparent weakness into unexpected strength. The lessons of Henderson's defense extend beyond military tactics into broader understanding of how individuals can influence events far larger than themselves. He faced overwhelming odds with inadequate resources in a military structure that systematically undervalued his capabilities because of his race. He could have simply followed orders, pulled back to the main defensive line, and let events unfold as they would. Instead, he saw a possibility that others had missed, and he had the courage to act on that vision despite the enormous personal risk. Modern military doctrine now explicitly teaches the principles Henderson improvised during that desperate December day: the use of decoys and false positions to create uncertainty in enemy planning, the psychological impact of unexpectedly effective resistance on enemy morale, the value of patience and tactical discipline over aggressive action, the importance of understanding enemy assumptions and using those assumptions to create tactical advantages. What doctrine cannot teach is the personal courage required to implement these principles while alone, cold, exhausted, and facing an enemy force 50 times larger than yourself. That kind of courage cannot be reduced to tactical principles or training protocols. It emerges from somewhere deeper, from a combination of character, determination, and an unshakable commitment to the mission and to the fellow soldiers depending on your success. Henderson's achievement also represents something larger than military tactics. It represents the contributions of African American soldiers who served with distinction in a war for freedom while their own country denied them basic civil rights. These soldiers faced enemy fire abroad and discrimination at home, yet they served with honor, courage, and exceptional skill. Their stories, like Henderson's, were often minimized or forgotten, not because their achievements were insufficient, but because a segregated society could not reconcile the cognitive dissonance of black soldiers demonstrating capabilities that contradicted racist assumptions. The recognition Henderson eventually received came too late and too grudgingly. He should have been celebrated immediately. His tactics should have been studied and disseminated throughout the military, and his example should have been used to challenge the fundamentally unjust segregation of the armed forces. Instead, he returned to civilian life with a medal in a drawer, and returned to a society that treated him as a second-class citizen, despite his extraordinary service to his country. The evolution of military attitudes toward Henderson's achievement mirrors the broader evolution of American society's understanding of the contributions of African American soldiers throughout history. From initial skepticism and dismissal to grudging acknowledgement, to eventual recognition that these soldiers were not exceptions, but rather representative of capabilities that had always been present but systematically denied opportunity for expression. Today, Henderson's defensive action at the Ardennes crossroads is cited in military training materials used around the world. Tactical officers in multiple countries study the engagement as an example of how innovative thinking and psychological operations can multiply the effectiveness of limited forces. Special operations units train soldiers in techniques derived from Henderson's improvised tactics. His achievement has influenced military doctrine at the highest levels. Yet the most important lesson of Henderson's story may be the one that extends beyond military applications. It is about seeing possibilities where others see only limitations. It is about having the courage to trust your own judgment even when conventional wisdom suggests a different course. It is about understanding that the greatest obstacles are often psychological rather than physical, and that changing perceptions can be as effective as changing material reality. In the end, James Henderson stopped a German advance, not because he had superior weapons or numbers, but because he understood something fundamental about human nature and military psychology. He understood that soldiers see what they expect to see, that assumptions can be more powerful than observation, and that apparent strength carefully deployed can outweigh actual strength carelessly applied. His brilliant trap was not made of steel or explosives. It was made of misdirection, timing, and an understanding that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not what you can do to your enemy, but what you can make your enemy believe about you. In that frozen December forest, one soldier with a rifle and an exceptional mind changed the outcome of a battle, saved countless American lives, and demonstrated that true tactical genius recognizes no boundaries of race, circumstance, or conventional military wisdom. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.